22 June 1941. Adolf Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa. After significant success in Europe and North Africa, Hitler decided to end his non-aggression pact with Stalin and launch a major offensive against the Soviet Union. On top of believing that the Soviets would be easily defeated, Hitler believed that Bolshevism was the ultimate antagonist to Nazism and must be wiped off the earth. Despite numerical superiority, the inept Soviet army paled in comparison to the highly skilled Wehrmacht. As a result, the German advance eastward was swift and devastating. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers were killed or captured in the first year alone. As of mid-December of that same year, German army groups north, center, and south pushed the Soviets back deep into Russian territory, creating a front that spanned from Leningrad in the north to Moscow in the center and ending below Kharkov in the south. By this time, the German advance slowed to a near halt, giving the Soviets time and space to regain their strength and fortify their positions. Over the next several months, fighting would continue with little territory gained and German supplies running thin. Therefore, a bold plan was enacted to reinvigorate momentum in the German advance. The overall plan would satisfy two major efforts. The first effort was to envelop the Soviet line from the southern end near Kharkov to break the stalemate. The second effort would be to seize the major oil fields in the Caucasus, providing desperately needed oil reserves to Hitler's panzer divisions. The execution would look something like this. German forces would defeat Soviet divisions along the southern flank, set up a defensive front along the Volga and Don rivers, and seize the oil fields in the south. In an operation known as Case Blue, German Army Group South split into Army Group A and Army Group B to satisfy this two-part mission. Army Group A would attack south into the Caucasus, and Army Group B would attack east to secure the Don and Volga rivers. As the Germans charged across the Russian steppe, Soviet troops did little to stop their advance. Using combined arms tactics mixed with ground and air forces, the German armies swept any Soviet forces in their path. What seemed to be a complete rout, however, was actually a tactical withdrawal. Soviet forces realized what the German army was doing and began to move eastward to take up more defensible positions along the rivers. It is at this time that a city became noticed as a strategic necessity by the generals of both sides. That city was Stalingrad. Stalingrad during this time was a major urban center along the Volga River. Possession of this city gave significant control over a major portion of that river. On top of this, the city's very name bore a great amount of psychological significance. Its seizure would deal a heavy blow to Soviet morale. As the Germans approached the city, Hitler made it clear to his generals that control of Stalingrad was of national importance. He ordered General Paulus of the 6th Army, reinforced with the 4th Panzer Army and 2 Romanian armies, to immediately lay siege to the city. It would be the German armies, however, that would enter the city, while the Romanian allies protected the northern and southern flanks. As the German forces set up outside of Stalingrad, Soviet forces inside the city began to make their own preparations. Instead of ordering a mass evacuation of the city, Joseph Stalin ordered that all civilians able to fight would participate in the upcoming battle. Anyone who could use a rifle was immediately conscripted into the army, and those who were too young or otherwise unable to fight were put to work building barricades and digging trenches. On 23 August 1942, the German Luftwaffe, mixed with long-range German artillery, began a horrific bombing campaign against the city, reducing it to rubble and killing thousands of civilians and soldiers in the process. After the bombing, German troops entered the city. To their shock, however, the Soviets were anything but eliminated. Instead, Soviet troops used the ruined buildings to their advantage, creating miniature fortresses strengthened with machine gun nests, mortar crews, and most notably, the sniper. Both forces fought tenaciously for every inch of the city. Before Stalingrad, combat in an urban environment wasn't necessarily rare, but neither sides were prepared for the apocalyptic maze that Stalingrad was. As the Germans pushed deeper into the city, the fighting only further intensified. As both sides were suffering heavy losses, the battle for Stalingrad turned into a personal showdown between Hitler and Stalin. Failure was simply not an option by either side. In the south, fighting centered around urban centers and railroad stations. Control for this area meant the seizure of hospitals and supply warehouses. Additionally, the railway networks provided an avenue of resupply to whoever owned it. Also in the south, a random house became the focal point for much of the fighting. This house, occupied by a Russian platoon commanded by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, became an impenetrable bunker that prevented German troops from moving closer to the Volga. Fighting here would last for the remainder of the battle and would become a legendary structure known as Pavlov's house. In the north, fighting centered mostly around Stalingrad's factory and industrial centers. Control for this area gave its owners access to crucial war materials and repair facilities. Despite the intense fighting in this area, Stalin ordered that the factories would remain on and the workers would continue working. Often tanks and other weapons would exit the factory and roll directly into combat, sometimes without paint or even gun sights in order to speed up production. Both areas were key objectives for control of the city, but it was the city's center, however, that would equate to domination of the heart of Stalingrad. A large hill, known as the Mamayev Kurgan, was both a tactical and operational objective. Overseeing the entire city, this hill provided keen observation to both commanders and artillery observers. Its control was also of symbolic importance. Control of this hill meant control of the city. Changing hands many times throughout the battle, the Mamayev Kurgan was the location of some of the heaviest fighting in Stalingrad and the ultimate gravesite of thousands of Russian and German soldiers. In the first few months of the battle, Soviet forces suffered immeasurable losses in their defense of the city. To make up for these losses, General Choikov of the 62nd Army continuously ferried conscript reinforcements across the river and sometimes directly into combat. The average lifespan for these soldiers once entering Stalingrad was a few hours at most, but this was not the most desperate action taken in defense of Stalingrad. Before the battle began on 28 July, Joseph Stalin issued Order 227, which was an effort to reinvigorate discipline in the Soviet ranks and prevent further withdrawal eastward. Of the many things mentioned in Order 227, its most notable directive was to establish blocking detachments behind troops in combat. These men, mostly made up of Soviet NKVD officers, were to stand behind and monitor the combat zone. Any Russian soldiers retreating were to be immediately shot and killed. This tactic was in keeping with the order's famous line, "Not one step back." Another directive of Order 227 was the establishment of Soviet penal battalions in Stalingrad. A virtual death sentence, penal battalions were made up of men accused of cowardice and who must avenge their honor. Often these battalions were lightly equipped and used to either clear enemy minefields or attack enemy strongpoints in order to fix the enemy in a certain direction and allow non-penal units to attack. Those who survived and avenged their honor could be transferred back to the normal rank and file, but risked being transferred back to penal battalions again. After 2 months of fighting, tens of thousands of soldiers were killed for control of Stalingrad. But by mid-November, German troops had managed to control 90% of the city. Barely occupying the western bank, it seemed that in only a matter of days the Soviet 62nd Army would be completely destroyed. But the Russians were about to receive help from an unlikely ally that only the Russians know so well. In early November, it began to snow, and would not stop for the remainder of the battle. Though no one knew it at the time, this winter would be one of the harshest ever recorded in Russian history. Termed General Winter by the Soviets, this austere weather managed to slow the German advance, allowing the Soviets to briefly recover. That being said, the Russian line was incredibly thin. One major push to the river by the German army could potentially crush the Soviets and solidify a major victory for Adolf Hitler. With the current situation, it would take a miracle to save the Russian army. But, as fate would have it, miles outside of Stalingrad, a miracle is exactly what would happen.